especially the online crowd. We will record this event over Zoom. So if you have any issue with the recording, please let me know afterwards and we will find some solution. Maybe we can close the door before we get started. And then... Okay, we're recording. I didn't know that. Okay. Okay, welcome to the autumn edition of PHO2, the joint research seminar of the Center for the Philosophical Studies of History and the Center for the Philosophy of Historiography. PHO2 stands for Ostrava Oulu, or Oulu Ostrava Research Seminar in the Philosophy of History. My name is Georg Gange, and I will be today's moderator. More importantly, today's speaker will be Marilynn Johnson, now to my right, very soon here in front of you, all of you, with the topic Archaeology as Historical Science, Centering the Human in Prehistory. Marilynn is Associate Professor in Philosophy at the University of San Diego in the US. And currently, she's also visiting professor at Institut Français de la Mode in Paris. Her main research interests lie in the philosophy of language, aesthetics, and the philosophy of archaeology, about which we will hear today. Of Marilynn's many publications, I only want to mention two here for you, which have some bearing to today's topic, I think. One of them is Seeking Speaker Meaning in the Archaeological Record, which was published in 2017 in Biological Theory. And then there's her book, Adorning Bodies, Meaning, Evolution, and Beauty in Humans and Animals, which came out in 2022 with Bloomsbury. As for the rest, other publications of Marilynn, I refer you to her homepage, which is very well kept and very informative. Now, after today, we will still have 4 more talks in the autumn edition of our seminar. The first talks will be directly today in a week, same time, 4 o'clock Eastern European time, 5 o'clock Finnish time. But it will be all online, only on Zoom, and there we will have Henrika Hanula speaking about existential historicism, the rise and fall of a sense-making framework. Then thereafter, on I think December 4, right, we'll have Ephraim Wallach from Hebrew University of Jerusalem talking about is the past real? ? Then on December 18, Fons de Wolf from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology will give the talk Reading in Historiography and Iterative Measurement, Atheism, Forgery, Cannibalism, and Deification? ? And finally, on the 28th of January of next year, we'll have Hermann Paul from the University of Leiden speaking on Epistemic Success in Historical Studies, Truth, Truthfulness, and Truer Than. These talks will all be on Zoom only. Now, if you want to stay updated about our activities, please consider following our social media accounts. There we publish all information about the talks and all the other events of both centers. Now, I'm nearly done, just technicalities. We will forcibly mute the online crowd during the talk because there is a big speaker in here, but worry not, you will be released for the discussion session. You can take part normally in it. After the talk, there will be a discussion session that I moderate. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, criticisms, please raise your hand either here in person or figuratively or semiotically online. And then we'll make a speakers list and we'll alternate between the room and online. And we will also prioritize people who haven't spoken yet. Okay, that was it from me. Thank you very much. Please, Marilynn, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for coming today in person and online. And as you can see, I'll be speaking to you today about archaeology as historical science, centering the human in prehistory. So let me start with a quote from archaeologists Potter and Hudson here from their book, Reading the Past, Current Approaches to Interpretation in Archaeology. And they note at the beginning of this text that feminist critiques of science have rightly noted that our ways of seeing cannot be entirely cut loose from our situated positions in the world. So I thought I'd start this presentation today by telling you about my situated position in the world and how I got into philosophy of archaeology, because that is relevant to what I will say next. So my interest in philosophy of archaeology began from research in philosophy of art and philosophy of language, thinking about these broad questions of interpretation and intention. So I wasn't coming at it from a philosophy of science perspective, traditional philosophy of science perspective per se, rather looking at archaeology as a domain where we create meaning, just like I'm creating meaning now with words. Artists create meaning with works of art. And in the interpretation of the archaeological record, what we're doing is we're interpreting acts of meaning. So because of this way into the subject, I have viewed archaeology as a means of thinking about aesthetics, communication, meaning, and symbols, which I will discuss today. I just realized I don't think I can see the time on this computer. I know someone has a
I'll let you know how much time.
Maybe. I'll just grab my phone really quick. Sorry. Okay. So tell you where we'll end up here. So I'll argue today that an important aspect of archaeological interpretation requires recognition of intentions. And for this reason, we need theories from philosophy of language and aesthetics to properly do philosophy of archaeology. And I'll also focus on the ways that this has been neglected, I think, in thought about philosophy of archaeology. Certainly the connections between archaeology and philosophy of science have been well documented, but I'll propose that there's actually a broader range of ways that philosophers can contribute to thinking about archaeology. And then there's also this kind of reflexive nature where I think we can also use, I won't get into that today, but this reflexive nature where we also can use archaeology to illuminate interesting philosophical questions, say about beauty and art, through considering the archaeological record as a test case for certain theories of art, for example. So further, aside from those issues about interpretation, intentions, aesthetics, and language, I'll also bring in connections between moral philosophy and archaeology, and in particular point out the way that the focus of human lives in archaeology has implications for human societies and power relations today. And because of that, there are distinct ethical issues that arise that philosophers of science aren't necessarily thinking about when they're considering other types of scientific domains. Okay, so the kind of takeaway will be that viewing archaeology through only a philosophy of science lens focused on general questions about evidence from traces narrows what philosophy truly has to contribute to archaeology. There's a valuable research program to do that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but just that we should take a broader view. Okay, so to start with Alison Wiley and her particular framing that has now become part of the canon of philosophy of archaeology to the extent that that exists. And in her work Between Philosophy and Archaeology, she considers the position that, quote, philosophy has an important role to play as a metaphorical handmaiden to the sciences. Wiley then continues this paper with the stated aim to show what philosophy has to offer archaeology. And she argues that with more knowledge of archaeological practice, philosophers will benefit and create better informed, more constructive analysis. So, is this true that philosophy should be seen as a handmaiden to the sciences? I do think it's true, and I take the point that we, as philosophers engaged in thinking about archaeology, that we should experience what it's like what the actual practice of archaeology is like as well. As I'll mention later in the talk, that's something I've done just a very little bit of, hoping to continue to do more in the future. But I've gone on an archaeological dig, for example, in Puerto Rico, which I'll mention. And, philosophers, we have a luxury of working with books, things that we can get online. We're not often out in the mud getting thorns in our fingers and our boots, as I did in Puerto Rico. And so it helps to certainly see the practicalities of the two different disciplines as you're doing philosophy of archaeology. Another philosopher of archaeology that I'll consider today is Adrian Currie, who has a number of different works where he discusses archaeology. I'll start with this 2018 thin book called Scientific Knowledge of the Deep Past. And in this text, he characterizes a number of views on archaeological interpretation as pessimistic. So this is a quote from that text. Christopher Hawkes' classic discussion of what he calls, quote, text-free history, the study of past human activity without written records, is an example of what he's discussing. Hawkes ranks the accessibility of aspects of humanity's past in terms of how human the fact in question is. Quote, the more specifically human are men's activities, the harder they are to infer by this sort of archaeology. The more human, the less intelligible. Currie continues, I take it that by human, Hawkes means specific, contingent, idiosyncratic activities that outrun our basic ecological needs. And in this text, Currie draws on two major case studies to illustrate his points. One is paleobiological, the second is geological. He's clear, however, to note that he's using the term, quote, historical science, but he clarifies by saying that he's not suggesting that there's a class of historical sciences that have a distinctive method or have a distinctive aim or whatever. However, it seems to me that studying archaeology in this context, in the context of paleobiological examples and geological examples, presents it with certain features more or less salient than they would be in other contexts. So the human side of archaeology in particular is de-emphasized in this context of geology and the study of dinosaurs, which I would consider to be more classical science examples. So this, of course, isn't to suggest that archaeology doesn't involve a scientific element. And scientific here, meaning roughly that you can conduct experiments over time, leading to generalities that you can then use to make predictions in the future. So for instance, discussion of LiDAR technology at Mayan sites is one such instance. LiDAR technology is basically technology that one archaeologist describes as allowing you to see through trees. You're up in the sky and you shoot a signal down, and it will bounce back to you off of rock, but not off of trees. So in the very dense jungle where there are Mayan sites, this allows a mapping of sites that would otherwise be invisible. So this is one instance of a scientific element. And then certainly other instances like carbon dating have revolutionized the field of archaeology, turned it from having less focus on dating using typology to using science. So archaeology certainly has these scientific elements. However, archaeology also involves a lot of other types of questions. So for example, the meaning of symbols of funerary artifacts, aesthetic aims in cave art, these are of a distinct and different type that require distinct types of explanations. And as I'll suggest today, philosophy of language and aesthetics are best equipped to provide answers to these types of questions. Philosophy of science, perhaps, best situated for thinking about carbon dating or LiDAR or anything like that. But issues of meaning have been the domain of philosophy of language and aesthetics. Okay, so Currie's discussion of this topic in this 2018 book ends with an appeal to what he calls an omnivorous strategy. As he says, it's not in a single line of evidence, but in their confluence. And he says this omnivorous strategy maximizes our epistemic reach into the past. So my suggestion today, I don't view as in conflict with Currie, but as a further tool that we can use as part of this omnivorous strategy that he proposes in his book to kind of mix these metaphors a bit. So we might ask, what is so distinctive about certain types of interpretation that they need their own method? And we could also ask, couldn't we just understand all interpretation as parallel to other types of scientific endeavors? And to motivate this position, we can again turn to Currie. So this is Currie now in this 2019 book, Rock, Bone, and Ruin, an Optimist Guide to the Historical Sciences. You might recall he characterized some other views as pessimistic, and here his view is an optimist guide. So he says, Adrian, the thought goes, you've made a fundamental error by lumping history together with the natural sciences. Human history is special because it has humans in it, intentional beings. The clearest exponent of such perspective is Collingwood. Currie continues, I think Collingwood got it wrong when he distinguished history and archaeology from natural science. Currie writes, scientific knowledge is highly internal, often involving reenactment. There is plenty of the internal in science then. You might insist that employing tacit resources to reenact a psychological explanation is fundamentally different from using them to understand the, quote, external events of scientific explanation, but this instance needs backing up. In virtue of what, if not requiring reenactment, might intentionality be a fundamentally different epistemic target? And it's this question that he poses rhetorically in the text that I'll return to multiple times throughout this talk. So, in virtue of what, if not requiring reenactment, might intentionality be a fundamentally different epistemic target? I think there are a couple of reasons why. Human history includes social factors that are not present in the processes of natural sciences. And reenactment of intentions is different than other types of reenactment because it involves a human perspective that does not amount to a, quote, view from nowhere. This influences the questions asked and answers deemed plausible and worthwhile. This, of course, is true in history more broadly as well. This has shaped what sort of histories have been documented and who we have records of from thousands of years ago. And this also has shaped interpretation of archaeology. So I'll give you a couple instances of this. So this is an article I just found about a week or two ago about Venus figurines, which I just learned there's a Venus figurine in Ostrava, which I'll have to go see at the museum here. In this article, at the bottom, as you can see, they asked participants to rate images of Paleolithic figurines for their attractiveness, age grouping, and reproductive status. The figurines, they had them rank are on the left here. I'm just curious, which is the one in
Number 10 is in Ostrava.
Okay, number 10 is in Ostrava. Okay, good to know. So I'll have to go see that one. That was quite interesting. It has no head at all, right? Okay. So these figurines have been found across many different sites. Was the one here was found locally?
Yes.
Okay. Found across many different regions, France, Spain, spanning quite a range, and they have been called Venus figurines, which is what the authors of this piece are taking as kind of their target. You can see on the right there the attractiveness rating that I think it was from 1 until 7. They included number 11 as a, quote, modern statue, which was deemed to be the most attractive. And this is their conclusion. They say, we suggest 3 possible rules for Venus figurines. Finally, a minority of images may have been intended to represent young, sexually attractive, and nulliparous, which I had to look up, that means not pregnant, adult female. These might truly be considered as Venuses in the conventional sense. Secondly, a subset of figurines represented changes in body shape during pregnancy and might be symbols of fertility. Thirdly, the figurines depicting the corpulent and often middle-aged women may not have been Venuses in any modern sense or a modern or conventional sense. They may instead have symbolized the hope for survival and for the attainment of a well-nourished and thus reproductively successful maturity during the harshest period of the major glaciation in Europe. Okay, so any option of interpretation like the one that these authors just said of the Venus figurines, will rely on some theory of meaning, implicit or explicit. Oh, that should say implicit or explicit. So let us think about some of the assumptions that were necessary for them to arrive at this conclusion. Okay, what is deemed sexually attractive today by a small sample of male undergraduates in New Zealand, that's who did the rankings, has some relevance to prehistoric European sites. The male gaze is the only relevant viewpoint on these bodies. Venuses are sexually attractive by these standards. A symbol of fertility must be pregnant. Corpulent and middle-aged are relevant concepts to prehistory. A well-nourished body is not attractive and cannot have been viewed as such in prehistory, and beauty standards or judgments of attractiveness do not change over time or across cultures. Okay, so I was, when I saw this study, I was appalled. But this is a sort of thing that was published. People thought this would be a good idea to choose to evaluate these figurines in terms of attractiveness, and then make this assumption that had some bearing on their meaning in prehistory. Okay, so this is an example of a particular viewpoint, a human viewpoint coming from two male researchers that shows their particular perspective. This is another article that actually predates the other one by many years. In the 90s. This text on the Venus figurines criticizes this idea that we should view them through as sex objects made from a male point of view, that women are just made to be on display for the sexual enjoyment of men, and suggests instead that these actually were sculptures that women made of their own bodies looking down, and that maybe change. There are some photos in this article that I didn't include, but they show photos of women viewed from their own perspective, looking at their own body, and then compare that to the figurines themselves. So different types of researchers, because of their situated positions in the world, taking different interpretive perspectives on the possibilities of these Venus figurines. This is another interesting case that I learned about at a Society for California Archaeology meeting about 2 years ago. That it was something I had never thought about prior to that time, but cradle boards as technology that would have aided foraging. So this researcher, and Alexandra Greenwald, looking at the weaving techniques here, and she actually did studies assessing maternal energetic costs from acorn foraging. I went to discuss this paper with the speaker after, and as I was speaking with her, we were interrupted by her child who was pulling on her leg. So it's easy to think about why this particular researcher would have thought of cradle boards in this way. So this is to make this point that human history, again, includes these social factors that aren't present in the processes of natural sciences. I wouldn't be able to come up with examples, exactly of this type with the geological cases, for instance. And reenactment of intentions involves a human perspective that doesn't amount to a view from nowhere. Again, influencing the questions asked and answers deemed plausible and worthwhile. So we have this question from Currie: in virtue of what, if not requiring reenactment, might intentionality be a fundamentally different epistemic target? And this takes us to the next point, which is on intentions and mind reading. So reenactment of intentions is importantly different from reenacting scientific processes, because one involves mind reading and another does not. Mind reading is very briefly a mental state about a mental state. Humans you might think of as mind reading machines. We can't help but do this. You're having a mental state perhaps about my mental state right now. Maybe you're texting someone having a mental state about their mental state. So we can't help but attribute mental states to other people. We even do this to a fault sometimes with inanimate objects. So for instance, I have a Roomba, a little, I assume you have something like that, and a little automated vacuum cleaner that goes around in my house. And sometimes I feel really sorry for him and I feel like he's working hard to like get over a carpet or something, right? So we can't help but have mental states of others, even in cases where we know that the other thing doesn't even have a mental state. We can't help but view the world in this way. So the importance of mind reading has been supported by a lot of research in cognitive science, in animal science as well. Michael Tomasello, in his work, The Origins of Human Communication, considers differences in mind reading and how those affect our ability to teach our offspring as helping to explain the vast difference between humans and other primates in our abilities to communicate. Philosopher of language Paul Grice, in his work, he doesn't use the term mind reading, but he focuses on intentions as being constitutive of meaning. So just to give an example, this is an example from Dan Sperber and Deirdre Wilson in their work on relevance. So let's say, I know you didn't say your name is actually as George, but
it's right.
American, I think, call you George. Okay, so let's say George and I were to take a train to Prague after this, and when they come through the hallway in the middle of the train with the cart, and they offer George coffee, I could turn to him and ask, "Oh, do you want coffee?" If he said coffee would keep me awake, I would need to know something about George's aims and intentions to understand if he was saying, yes, I want coffee, or no, I don't want coffee, right? I might have known prior to that he told me he wanted to work the whole time. He had to give a presentation as soon as we got to Prague, or maybe he just popped some sleeping pill and I know he's about to fall asleep. So this is, as I said, an example from Sperber and Wilson, highlighting that what we do when we're communicating with language is we're not really decoding a code. What we're doing is we're using language as a tool to think about someone else's mental states. So I'm a Gricean, and that means I follow in the tradition of Paul Grice and viewing meaning as being constituted by intentions. And I think this is true in language, even in art, fashion, across the range of communicative acts that we do. I think meaning is fixed by the intentions of the creator or speaker or artist when they make an artifact, in meaning, in archaeology, and in meaning more broadly. In the article that George mentioned at the beginning about the biological theory piece from 2017, I bring in some Gricean framework to propose 5 different types of meaning that we create and that we interpret using a different method. So let me talk those through. So the first I'll call non-intentional. And this would be, as it says here, use of scientific instruments and tools such as carbon dating. I mentioned LiDAR technology as well. And certainly in archaeology, a lot of what we do with interpretation is that non-intentional type, looking at predictable rates of decay, looking at residue found in soil, things of that nature are non-intentional in the sense that we're not thinking about anybody's mind, and things weren't made or put in that place for a reason. And then we get 4 different types of intentions, what I've separated out into 4 different types of intention here. So number 3, I'll start with number 3 because 2 is kind of parasitic on 3. Number 3 is use intentional. So in the, excuse me, in the archaeological record, we have a lot of things, of course, that were created to be used for a specific purpose. And when we find something like that, we can ask which role or function the object could have served. If we find a knife that seems a little bit too big to be used, maybe too symmetrical, too beautiful, then we might start wondering if it was made for a different purpose. But much of what's found in the archaeological record it's clear we can infer from looking at it what the use would have been. Number two is things that were produced intentionally, in a sense. So when you make a knife, for instance, there are shards that are left, and those were made intentionally, but those, what I call byproducts, weren't the object of the intention. And to figure out why those are there, that we consider which intentional artifact could have resulted in this object. Another example of a byproduct would be the coffee that was just made for us at the coffee shop that we went to, right? So the coffee served a functional role of affecting our nervous system to make us more awake. And then in the coffee shop right now, there are coffee beans in a trash can, and those are the byproduct of something that had an intention. And then we get to number 4 and 5. Number 4 and 5 are the communicative aspects. So as I mentioned, with the use intentional kinds, sometimes it seems like there's something more going on, or there's some feature that doesn't appear to have a functional role. In those cases, then it's supposed perhaps it was meant to be symbolic. And I break the symbolic into 2 different categories as well. But first, I call signaling intentional, resulting in what we call semantic meaning. You're kind of thinking of a distinction from Kripke. And this is decoding in accordance with meaning determined by established correlations or associations. Decoding. So for instance, black mourning clothing in the 19th century had an established coded meaning across different contexts. But of course, as I've illustrated with the coffee would keep me awake example, often what we're doing with meaning isn't constrained to codes in this way. And what we're doing instead is interpretation in accordance with recognition of complex meaning intentions that will be contingent on knowledge of the speaker. Okay, so here are just some other pictures kind of showing you that distinction. We have the work by Impressionists where we had visible brushstrokes where we're meant to read in something to those brushstrokes themselves. Those have a communicative purpose. We have something like a lily signifying the Virgin Mary as a code, hand axes as being functional tools. On the very left there, we have the Sistine Chapel and some marks that were not put there by Michelangelo, but that were the result of degradation over time that were removed when the Sistine Chapel ceiling was cleaned. And then intentional byproducts, so I could have put the coffee grounds here. Those would also include things that the artist tried to conceal, as was the case for this particular painting. So as mentioned, I have participated in a little bit of the work of archaeology myself. This is in Cabo Rojo, Puerto Rico in 2017. This was with a group from the University of Miami. And we were working at a site here that they had found the previous year. There are 2 square holes in the ground here, and there's a box in the front. We were meticulously going down bit by bit in those holes in the back. And then everything that we dug up was put here to be sifted. And this is my hand in these photographs now. And what we were doing was separating the shells that we found from the soil, which we would which was left in Puerto Rico. This is what's known as a shell midden, basically a prehistoric trash heap. So the equivalent of the coffee grounds at the coffee shop right now. And these shells were eaten. They were used for food source. So the archaeologists at the site were tracking what were the different species of shells that were found. They were also looking at how climate change affected the diet of these people. This was 5,000 years ago, this site. And then we were also, of course, looking for things that might have been tools. So not just dirt, which is non-intentional or a byproduct of having eaten. We're also looking for any types of artifacts. So we were told, if you find anything that might be an artifact that doesn't look just like dirt or just waste, go ahead and show it to the archaeologist, and she will look at it and then make a determination about if it's something that is worth taking back to Miami or not. So I found this one. To me, this looked like a possible tool. I could imagine using it to pry open a shell, perhaps. I paused and showed this to Carmen, the archaeologist working on this site, and she looked at it for half a second and immediately said rock and threw it over her shoulder. So she had some knowledge that I didn't have. She was able to classify that as non-intentional immediately. This one, Carmen told me to put it in a bag, and that meant we were taking it back to Miami. This one has some other features. It looks like it has been perhaps used already, maybe a prehistoric shell opener. And if so, then it was the sort of thing that was used for a particular purpose, and thus a tool, an artifact. We also found these shell beads. The one at the top appears to have been colored, and the holes appear to have been meticulously created. Of course, wearing shells as beads is something we continue to do today. Perhaps somebody in this room right now has a shell bead on right now. And of course, we also saved these. With shell beads, there is the possibility that they were used for a communicative purpose, just like jewelry is today. To find an example of a meaning intentional artifact, we didn't find anything like that in Puerto Rico. This is from King Tut's tomb. This is an interesting case. In King Tut's tomb, there are a few instances of his enemies being found, which seems a bit strange, because why would you want your enemies to follow you into the afterlife? But this is actually, it's upside down here. This is actually the top of a staff. It would have been held in a hand like this. So King Tut would actually have the opportunity here to crush his enemies in his hand in the afterlife. So this is the sort of thing that it almost has that nuanced meaning, like coffee would keep me awake, where what we have to do to figure out what's going on is think about the particular intentions and the why of why would you put your enemies in the tomb, see the context and use that to realize, aha, that's the gesture and the meaning of this artifact. Okay, so with that framing from philosophy of language coming together with archaeology, let me now turn to consider aesthetic response and interpretation as another reason why reenactment might, another reason why intentionality is a fundamentally different epistemic target. After this, I'll turn to ethics as another reason why. So with beauty itself and in aesthetics, we can draw an important distinction between beauty that's intentional and beauty that just happens to be that way. This is coming from an ornithologist, actually, Richard Prum, who has this book, The Evolution of Beauty, Have Darwin's Forgotten Theory of Mate Choice Shapes the Animal World and Us. And in this text, he draws our attention to this distinction. He writes, floral shape, color, and scent are not beautiful in the same way as a sunset or the twinkling stars. Because flowers are products of co-evolving art worlds consisting of multiple competing plant species communicating to and co-evolving with the sensory systems of multiple discerning, judgmental individuals of different species of pollinators. By contrast, the color of the sunset and twinkling of the stars are determined by physical mechanisms that cannot co-evolve with our evaluations of them. So those of you who are familiar with Danto's work in aesthetics might have noticed the use of the term art worlds here. So art worlds, this notion of art worlds comes from 20th century aesthetics attempting to explain cases like Warhol's Brillo boxes, how Warhol's Brillo boxes could be art, for instance. And Crum argues that animal bodies, bird feathers, as you can see on the cover here, for example, have co-evolved in the same way that artworks co-evolve with their evaluation. He has in mind here Darwin's sexual selection theory, which he's in support of. But the important takeaway from this quote is that things that co-evolve to be beautiful are different from things like the sunset and the twinkling stars that didn't evolve because of an evaluation of its beauty. So here are some of the types of things that would still be beautiful, would still exist if nothing and no one, no species was evaluating them. And then we have human-made artifacts that were certainly intended to be beautiful, and their beauty cuts across time. And this is one reason that Egyptian archaeology is so valued, because of its aesthetic properties. Archaeologist Colin Renfro notes that the aesthetic experience is a reality for many of us and an underlying motivating force in our enterprise. And we might consider the possibility that, as Crown considers here in 1995, this is in the same compilation as the Renfro piece, aesthetic responses may be primarily based on shared and nearly universal sense perceptions. It might be argued that certain conclusions can be drawn on the basis of the shared neurophysiological apparatus of all human beings. For instance, the appeal and dazzling effect of the shimmer of jewels, gold, feathers, and shells is something that we might expect to have been nearly constant throughout time, and is certainly something that's present across cultures and times. And this is not lost on archaeologists either. Archaeologist Mary Steiner, in her work on shell beads, has concluded that preferences in ornament making seem to have been guided by perception of rarity and color. Bright colors and vivid markings that catch our eye today were also arresting for prehistoric viewers. Red and luminous white shells were valued across many Upper Paleolithic instances. This is an example of some of the types of shells that were found in prehistory. This is from a text by archaeologist Francesco D'Errico. These are about 90,000 years old, found in North Africa. And in his work, D'Errico meticulously analyzes these under a microscope, will establish that the holes were made by hand, and often these types of shell beads even have tiny scratches on them from having been rubbed against clothing. And we can see their striking beauty. This is from another researcher, Solange Ringaud, at the same, working with Francesco D'Errico at the University of Bordeaux. And through considering these types of cases, we can think about the possibility of some universal aesthetic judgments of beauty. This is a hand axe found in Great Britain from 400,000 years ago. This is one that's proposed to have been created for aesthetic purposes rather than function. It's thought to be too big to have been actually used as a tool. It's also very finely shaped, and you might think if the tool is just for mere functional purposes that you might not have spent this much time on it. So it's been proposed perhaps that this is signaling the skill of the maker and was on display. Animals too, as I mentioned with the Prum already, seem to have some perhaps sense of an aesthetic eye that we may share. This is, anybody know what creature made this? This is a bowerbird found, you were gonna say, okay, in Australia and Papua New Guinea. There are different species of bowerbirds. It's really fascinating to learn about what they do. So the males will create this shape, which is known as a bower. It's just to attract the female. So this is another instance of sexual selection. They will meticulously create these little piles, artworks perhaps, and they will pick out when the flowers become brown. They'll throw them out, so they'll maintain the beauty of their bower. And they also will spend even more time than they spend creating their bower. They'll fly around and mess up the other male's bowers as well. So we have perhaps aesthetic judgments of being attracted to certain details, colors, and so on that have shaped what people found appealing and arresting in prehistory. And perhaps we can seek some universal aesthetic categories through considering archaeological record. Okay, but now to turn to the ethical dimension of this. So what are we to say of archaeologists feeling moved by the aesthetic experience of artifacts and sites that they discover? So we have that quote from Colin Renfro that the aesthetic draw of artifacts is a motivating drive for many in their field. What are we to say about this? What is the relation of such experiences to the aims of archaeological interpretation? Are these aesthetic considerations at odds with viewing archaeology as science? And what are the ethical implications of ignoring cultural context and seeking these types of universal principles in archaeological interpretation, as I was suggesting we might be able to do? This is from a book by Howard Carter, who discovered the tomb of King Tut in the 1920s. He writes, "The exhilaration of discovery, the fever of suspense, the almost overmastering impulse born of curiosity to break down seals and lift the lids of boxes, the thought pure joy to the investigator that you're about to add a page to history or solve some problem of research, the strained expectancy, why not confess it, of the treasure seeker." Carter, in his work in finding this intact tomb, which is why King Tut is important today, not because he was particularly important pharaoh at that time, but his tomb hadn't been looted extensively by the time we found it. It actually had been, Carter proposes that it had been looted a very, very long time ago, but that the thieves were caught and then it was resealed during the time of ancient Egypt. And so Carter is at times in this text critical of the methods of other archaeologists. He tries to be more careful. They had photography at this time that they were meticulous in using each time they went into a new space, taking photos before they touched anything. He criticizes others who have let artifacts be taken out of context because he illustrates the way that context is so important to interpretation. However, despite all this, Carter himself was also subject to the temptation of coveting artifacts, and it was discovered after Carter's death that a number of items from King Tut's tomb were in his home, which was expressly forbidden by the Egyptian government at that time. So the lure of the beautiful artifacts even was so seductive, if you will, that Carter couldn't resist it. And we can see in this potential tension between archaeology as science, or as providing us with a complete picture of history, and archaeology as something motivated by aesthetics. At the same time, surely ignoring the beauty of objects that were created to be beautiful is to not fully interpret them. However, we should be mindful of the seduction of beautiful artifacts where it conflicts with ethical concerns, and I do think there's a tension there. Colin Renfro wisely notes that to condemn the folly and vandalism of looting and the art market which sustains it need not entail the view that all aesthetic sentiments are reprehensible. Another tricky subject related to the aesthetics of archaeology is focusing on accessing sites in the digital age in particular, this has gotten worse. It was bad for Carter as well. In the 1920s, he documents the way he says he had friends he never knew existed who wanted to see the tomb once they discovered it. So it's still, there was Tut mania in the 1920s. Everybody wanted to go to the tomb. But now, more than ever, we have easier access to planes and more demand on TikTok and Instagram to go to a site, get a photo. And this desire to see it ourselves, to have that aesthetic experience, if you will, can lead to destruction. Just your mere presence in a space will degrade it in some small way. Some famous cave sites like Lascaux in France, for instance, which was found in the 1940s, it's close to the public now because it was really sadly degraded through the breath of people, the millions of people that have walked in the cave of Lascaux. They used to even smoke in the cave, the French back in the day, having their cigarettes in the Lascaux cave. They installed an air conditioning system in this cave that had been preserved for 17,000 years. And yeah, so our drive to see beautiful things, to see King Tut, I already mentioned I want to go see the Venus figurine here in Ostrava. That drives us to have an interest in archaeology is often having this tension, and our mere presence can lead to degradation of sites. A further ethical issue arises in focusing on the most beautiful objects in archaeology. So King Tut, for instance, focusing on the most beautiful artifacts leads to prioritizing the stories of the powerful who often obtain these beautiful or time-consuming artifacts on the back of the workers whose stories go untold. This is certainly not an exhaustive list of the ethical aspects of archaeology, but these are just a few that are ethical issues that arise from an aesthetic dimension. Okay, so in light of some of these issues raised today, displays of indigenous artifacts in America have recently been undergoing a change in how they are treated. This was during the Biden administration. The Museum of Natural History closed 2 major halls in response to updated policies from the Biden administration. Since 1990, there's been a law in America called NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. During the Biden administration, they basically gave more power to the tribes to determine what was a sacred item, and that meant that many halls were closed. At that time, Sean Decatur, president of the American Museum of Natural History, says the halls we're closing are artifacts of an era when museums such as ours did not respect the values, perspectives, and indeed shared humanity of indigenous people. And this was just last week. There was, so it says, indigenous artists infiltrate the Met with guerrilla AR project. So these artists created an app, is my understanding. I didn't go, but create an app that you can look at, on your device, on your iPad, for instance, as you walk around the museum, and it adds native and indigenous imagery and artwork on top of the other pieces that are in the Met. So thinking about archaeology and our own role as people involved in narratives about history and archaeology, we're part of shaping what narratives get told, or shaping, the philosophy about what narratives get told. And on any campus, I'm not familiar with museums on this campus in particular, but if you see something unethical going on in the galleries on campus or community, I think it's important when we're doing archaeology to think about whose stories are being told and why. And something I've tried to do in my own work on this is to embrace the role of philosopher as gadfly. For example, this is a gallery space at the University of San Diego where I am a professor. It's called the David W. May Gallery. As you can see, it's right outside the anthropology department on our campus. And this last year was the 30 years since the creation of this gallery. Dorothy Zalma-May donated, I believe, $1 million to the University of San Diego, as well as a number of artifacts that she had collected in the American Southwest from various tribes. The university was planning to hold this event. It was the 75th anniversary of our university. And through working with other faculty members, including Kevin Guerrieri and our tribal liaison, we were able to raise the awareness of the problematic nature of celebrating this history of some of these artifacts, given how they were collected, given the fact that some of them had to be repatriated to indigenous tribes, and the gallery space remains closed now on campus. So we must remember that archaeology as a study of cultures and people told through their material remains is different from collections of other sorts of things, such as naturally formed stones and animal fossils, or art galleries, to again think of the gallery spaces on the University of San Diego campus. We have, artworks that are on display, and however, the indigenous artifacts have a different history, a different process of collection that makes it entirely different. Means that there are different ethical concerns. So museums with artifacts are always narrated from either a we or a they perspective, and this is not the case for natural sciences. Just to show you one example of a museum that I went to this past summer in California, that is an indigenous tribe talking about their own artifacts. They're able to use a we perspective rather than a they perspective. And they have collections that these are 8,000-year-old arrowheads, very beautiful, as you can see, that were found on site. So they talk about the history of their people. These are holes that were made from grinding of food sources, of acorns and things like that. So a really big stone would have been dropped repeatedly into these spaces. And this is the Agua Caliente Band of Kuya Indians, Agua Caliente Cultural Museum. And so we get this story about their culture prior to the arrival of Europeans. And then there's this plaque on the wall here from 1770 to 1903. Our world changed forever when European colonizers arrived in California. Through the middle of the 19th century, outsiders remained mostly along the coast. When the United States conquered California in 1848, catastrophic tide began to sweep across our homelands. So we get a narrative told from a completely different perspective. Archaeology has a specific history of power that has influenced who and what has been dug up, who has had access to sites, who took artifacts home to their museums, and whose knowledge has been valued in constructing narratives. And because of these reasons, it's essential that the human side of archaeology not be sidelined. And in particular, I think there are negative ethical implications to treating archaeology like a natural science. To conclude, such discussions of intention, aesthetics, and ethics in archaeological interpretation show the importance of philosophers with a range of backgrounds engaging in work on prehistory. I think our role as philosophers can be to help make the application of philosophical theories to archaeology more precise and bring relevant frameworks to light with new archaeological applications. I take myself to have done this with the Gricean framework. And we can also demonstrate when certain philosophical theories are being applied where they shouldn't. Contra Currie, we ought not sideline the human side of archaeology and attempt to better fit it within theories from philosophy of science. Rather, we should encourage a capacious view of what all areas of philosophy have to contribute to archaeology. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think we can start with questions from the room, and then we'll set up for online. They can ask too. Anybody who wants to ask something immediately here in the room? Do you have a question, David?
I can wait.
Well, there's nobody else at the moment. You can.
So can I just ask for a clarification of your, how do you approach reenactment from Collingwood? Is it do you understand it as a methodological thesis, or do you understand this about as a, such some kind of metaphysical proposition, such as there is even the reenactment must be possible. Reenactment of thought of past agents must be possible in order for us to do any type of history or archaeology. Because I think there is this discussion concerning methodological interpretation and sort of metaphysical interpretation of Collingwood's reenactment.
Okay.
So which position are you arguing for, or do you find it closer?
So do I think it has to be possible to
Because from what I know about Collingwood discussion, there is one understanding of Collingwood's idea of reenactment as a methodology, proper methodology for historians and archaeologists. But it is unclear whether he himself, when he was writing his archaeological works, whether he followed this method or whether it's just, it's a metaphysical statement that there must be some access to the minds of others in the past for us in order to do historical or to attain historical or archaeological understanding.
Yeah, so as I said, my approach to this is Gricean. So yeah, maybe we can chat more about how that like maps on with the Collingwood framework. But so for Grice, what I would say is there certainly is a gap between the metaphysics and the epistemology of intentions. So for Grice, the meaning is what the person intended when they made it. I can certainly misinterpret someone, and there can be this epistemic problem of not having access to what the person intended. But so for Grice, it's a metaphysical claim about meaning, and that meaning is what the person intended. The meaning is constrained. So I was thinking of some other philosophy of language examples like Humpty Dumpty type cases. So for Grice, it doesn't mean that you can intend anything with anything. It is constrained by how you think you'll be interpreted. And so that's shaped by how you have been interpreted in the past. So for instance, I can't, I don't know. Well, okay. Yeah, I can't wave a Make America Great Again hat right now and think that I'm making some kind of pro-Czech statement or whatever. I don't know, pro Kamala Harris statement.
Upcoming Prime Minister is using the red ball from Czechia. So can you move a little bit to your right? So we can maintain the contact with you.
Okay. Hello,
yes.
online people. Okay. Yeah. So for Grice, there is the claim about meaning is a metaphysical claim about what an utterance or an artifact means. And then there's this separate epistemic question about how it will be interpreted. However, the epistemic constrains the metaphysical side, which is how you get around kind of Humpty Dumpty type problems. So you can't mean whatever you want to mean. With the archaeological cases, of course, it's even harder than when you're talking to someone on a train to figure out what their intention is, right? So there is this longer gap, degradation of material over time, less information about the culture that will make it more challenging to figure out what that person intended. But for instance, from the hand axe that I showed, the 400,000-year-old hand axe, there's a hypothesis that this is too big to have been used as a tool. It's too finely made to have been used as a tool, and that is positing a mental state about what they would have had in mind. Can we go back and ask them? Of course not. And so there are certain epistemic constraints that are stronger in archaeology than they would be in other situations where I can ask George, like, oh, why are you having I always do that to my students when they hear the name. I could clear if I thought he meant he didn't want coffee, and then he starts chugging a 5-hour energy drink. Like I would then ask, like, George, what's going on? I thought you were trying to take a nap, right? So we have miscommunications in person all the time, but then we're afforded the opportunity to clarify and refine our intentions. So yes, there certainly are issues. It will be difficult to ascertain what people meant, but the Gricean framework, I think, gives us something to aim at. And then because in philosophy of language, people have done so much work on intentions and meaning, it kind of can provide an opportunity to get around objections that would arise in the archaeological domain that philosophers of language have already thought about. And yeah, but how that maps on, I'd love to hear, we can talk more later about how that maps on with what Collingwood has in mind. But I would definitely draw on the Gricean framework about the metaphysical versus epistemic.
Okay, we got 2 questions online now. First, Josepina Doro, and then perhaps from the room, me too, if there's some time. But first, Josepina Doro, then Alias Ataka, and then perhaps the room again.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for a really interesting talk. I couldn't always hear, so I hope that I've understood you. So I wanted to pick up on something that you said at the very beginning about philosophy as the handmaiden of archaeology or the sciences. And I wasn't quite sure whether you were agreeing or disagreeing with that claim. Perhaps you presented it as somebody else's claim. But I just thought that, in a way, if I mean, your very talk seems to be an illustration of why philosophy cannot be just the handmaiden to the sciences. Because in some ways, I'm not saying that it cannot have that role, but that it cannot be exhausted, that role cannot be exhaustive of what philosophy does. Because in a way, I thought that what you were doing here was trying to, if you like, disentangle different complexes of question and answers and say, well, look, even within archaeology, there are different concerns that we have. There is perhaps an aspect of archaeology, like forensic archaeology, which is definitely a natural science and is definitely a historical science. But on the other hand, there is an aspect of archaeology that is a humanistic inquiry because, insofar as, it identifies something, a shell, as a bead, then it has already brought it under a description, a very thick description, and can be only understood as a bead in the context of, say, a human practice of adorning one's body and, making jewelry and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I very much like the way in which we say, well, look, there are different concerns with the past, and we've got to recognize that there are these different concerns. So there's definitely, if you like, a past that we understand through the tools of science, but there's also a past that somehow we cannot even begin to comprehend through scientific tool, because somewhat we have to switch perspective and seeing it in the context of human practices and so on and so forth. So I was just wondering, what your position on the role of philosophy is, because in a sense, I thought that if I understood what you were saying and your criticism of Currie, you're saying, there is more than one past here. There's more than one way of looking at the past. And then what is it that philosophy does? Well, it helps us precisely to see that. And so it cannot just be, in that sense, a handmaiden of science.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe I misunderstood you because you were not saying that.
No, thank you for that. No, you're right. That's really helpful. Toward the end, I made it really clear that I was contra Currie, but I should make it more clear. I'm also contra the handmaiden to the sciences.
Okay, right.
Yeah, so I can tie that. I'm still working on this as a paper, but that's a very helpful point and definitely something I should do to kind of connect that thread back to the beginning as well. Yeah, in some sense, we were talking about it a little bit today before the presentation. Doing interdisciplinary work is it's always a challenge, right? So my PhD is in philosophy. I'm, trained stylistically in philosophy, and I only went on this dig as a student. And so I do take Wiley's point that philosophers should learn more about archaeology if we're doing philosophy of archaeology to see, why in some cases is it so tempting to draw conclusions that aren't supported by the evidence, or to have a narrative that's really sexy. Of course, there's other things about academy and funding and all those other things that shape all of our lives as well. But you can see, when you're really out there, my legs were covered in bruises. I had thorns in my fingers for weeks after that. I still kept pulling out. It did change my perspective on what archaeologists are doing and how they view the evidence. And even that very brief experience for me did change how I view and understand philosophy of archaeology. And so I take that point that yes, we do kind of, we should do what the archaeologists want us to do, or learn what it's like from their perspective, go to archaeology conferences and so on. But at the same time, philosophy and aesthetics, ethics, it can provide a check, maybe like checks and balances or whatever, to some of the assumptions of archaeologists as well. So I agree, the handmaiden, we shouldn't stomp in as arrogant philosophers, just correcting maybe easy theoretical points, but try to have some sort of balance. Between the two. Yeah, Wiley in that same article talks about how sometimes philosophers are like people watching and criticizing a soccer game when they've never played. So, we want to avoid that. We want to avoid being a handmaiden, and we want to avoid being the person on the sideline watching and criticizing Messi, right? But I think there's, wherever there's some sort of sweet spot in between the two. But yeah, thank you. That's really helpful, and I definitely should go back to that handmaiden to the sciences point.
Okay, great. So now, as per our rules, we have the room first again. Is there somebody in the room who would have any question, comments, concerns? Otherwise, I would put myself on. I'm the moderator, but I'm also in this room, and then after me, it's Avias Ataka. Maybe about compatibility. I think if you say it up in a very general way, compatibility. So okay. Nobody probably would disagree that sort of there's something like the ethics and the aesthetics of archaeology as well. And this has determinate consequences, results on it in terms of what has been researched, what is considered beautiful, what is displayed in a museum, why is it done that way? That issue might be can be subsumed as something like the axiology of archaeology, right? The question of values and how values interfere or are incorporated into archaeology. But then the other question is, to what extent is there this compatibility epistemically in the epistemic process of archaeology? Would you also, I would say, nobody disagrees there's something like axiology of archaeology, and it's important in many ways. It's also important ideologically and negatively. The example you had with the ridiculous stuff about beauty standards, modern beauty standards projected back into the past. But the interesting question then is sort of, does ethics and aesthetics also play a role in the epistemic process of archaeology, historiography as well? And does it play this role in a different way than any other theory would do, as background theory, to set up some kind of, or as hypothesis to explain either something to account for the evidence or to explain the past? And if it was in the second case, then you might have a really strong case in the second that there is something distinctively different about the human subject matters, which has aesthetics and ethics more baked into them than non-human historical sciences. And I think the latter question is also connected to the general question, sort of the philosophical meta-classification of the sciences. Is there such a thing as historical sciences that cut through subject matters, no matter human or not? Or is there some specific human subject matter which differentiates all the human sciences from natural sciences? It could be sort of simplistically put historical sciences proposal versus Collingwood or something like that. And I think this is very much strongly linked to the latter point here, whether the epistemology of the historical sciences different, not whether there's an axiology that goes beyond because humans are researching it. I'm not sure if that makes sense what I'm asking, but
I'm trying to follow your question.
okay, no.
So you're asking like, do the values bear on the epistemic
Yes, I mean,
question?
the basic point is, of course, there are all kinds of values and value judgments in archaeology, like in any other science, also natural sciences,
Right.
presumably. That's clear. There's a compatibility there. Hardly anybody will disagree that there's such a thing.
There's a compatibility.
Yeah. The question is, do these things interfere or interject or are part of the epistemic process itself? And if they are they part of it in a way that would set the historical human sciences apart from the historical natural sciences?
I see.
That would be the point against Currie, then, if I understand him correctly, that sort of, if there was a specific way in which ethics or aesthetics or maybe philosophy of language intentionality interferes or is baked into, then you got a case for the sort of meta classification of the sciences to be not historical sciences but human subject matter versus nature.
Okay.
Maybe something like that.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that there's a tension, that there's a tension between epistemic, aesthetic, and the ethical in these cases. So that's what I was hoping to demonstrate. So I certainly don't see the epistemic as being a separate question from the aesthetic and the ethical. The example of the Venus figurines and the cradle board, for instance. So the human aspect of archaeological interpretation, because it's human behavior, it's men and women or whatever gender categories they had, right? Moving in the world as, trying to do a lot of the same things we do, like have children, eat food. Because of that, there's this added perspectival nature to the types of questions that are seen as worthwhile. Epistemic, what questions are we asking? So with the cradle board one, for instance, should cradle boards be viewed as technology? There's another slide that I cut that is from the caryatids that were on the side of the Parthenon. And I have an archaeologist friend who looks at, there's really elaborate braiding, and she looks at that braiding as technology. So I don't view that as a mere aesthetic question. I view that as an epistemic question of like what counts as technology that's shaped by, the perspective of the researchers. And going back to the ethics of having things in museums, repatriation, one reason people will give against repatriation is that then that limits what we have access to study. So King Tut, for instance, the mummy of King Tut has been taken out of the tomb and put in different imaging technologies so we could look at his foot, for instance. So they found all those staffs in his tomb, and there's a question like, oh, was he disabled? Did he have a problem with his foot? And we've answered those, gotten more information about those because we've done research on him. Was that ethical? I don't know. It's pretty clear King Tut wanted to stay in his tomb forever. We know his belief system. We have the Egyptian Book of the Dead coupled with everything we found in his tomb itself. And so that's one case where I think I might be in the minority here, but I think it was wrong to take King Tut out of his tomb because of the epistemic drive, which is often what science focuses on, and science, the practice of archaeology itself is always destructive, even if you don't take out King Tut. Howard Carter found roses, dried flowers that had been preserved for 3,000 years, and as soon as he touched them, they turned to dust. So yeah, I certainly think that these aren't distinct questions, the aesthetic, the ethical, and the epistemic. I see them as often incompatible. But yeah, if I misunderstood you.
Yeah, we can discuss it later.
Yeah.
Okay, next is Agesa Taka from online.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. And thank you for visiting us in Ostrava. I'm sorry I was unable to attend in person, but greetings from the United States. So let's talk a little bit about ontology and epistemology. So we all agree that archaeology and human historiography have an ontology that includes intentions because we are dealing with people. We all agree that cosmology has an ontology that involves gravity. And human beings are also natural objects, so we are also subject to gravity, but stars are not subject to intentionality, even though, as you say, human beings have a tendency to misinterpret things in intentional terms, and they can say that the planets want to move around the sun, but they are attracted by some other object and then project all sorts of anthropomorphic properties to it. Now, the immediate, and here where we would start disagreeing, the immediate object of archaeology is not people. The immediate object of archaeology is dirt and remnants and ruins. That's what the archaeologists can touch and photograph and analyze and record. When they talk about intentions, that's only when they can infer it from the objects, and then from what they actually immediately are in touch with and immediately can investigate. And sometimes, and actually many times, there's just insufficient evidence to know the intentions of the people who created those artifacts. And then the temptation is to start projecting our own politics, our own concerns, our own intentions on objects that cannot resist those projections. You mentioned those statuesques from the Stone Age that we find all over Europe. So we know this is not a coincidence. It's a part of a culture because there's more than one of them. And actually, the only exception is the Ostrava one because it's a younger woman who's not who didn't have time to become as buxom as the other ones. What we don't know, of course, is what was the intention. And you posted one article there that had the word colonization in the title, projected on 20, 30, 40,000 year old objects. That's obviously bogus. And my claim then, that if you limit archaeology to the study, and historiography for that matter, to the study of intentions, it's going to be much thinner than it actually is. Much of archaeology will have to disappear. Firstly, you have this whole layer of studying of the evidence, which has nothing to do with intentions and non-intentions. It's just material science. There are things you can touch and analyze and ask when were they created, what material was used, what was the technique, can you replicate that? And that's all before we start with investigating intentions. Intentions come much later. And you would end up with something that is much thinner because there's very strong limit to telepathy, to getting into the heads of people. As you mentioned, yeah, we know that our ancestors had some concept of death, they had some concept of sex, they had some concept of food. That's pretty much where it ends. Then culture takes over and we cannot project ourselves on that past. And that means that in many cases when we don't have enough evidence, we just don't know. And we have to admit that we just don't know. And then archaeology, if it's just about intentions, will be much more limited. And finally, when you talk about ethics, that's because archaeological objects cannot talk for themselves. That's when the contemporary politics comes and takes over, and then it creates bogus concepts of the past. And that's has been since the creation of archaeology, which coincided with nationalist age, when people talked about the French archaeology, English archaeology. These concepts are totally modern. And of course, the very concept of indigenous people is bogus. What indigenous about humanity? We left Africa. I mean, maybe some people in Kenya are indigenous because their ancestors never moved. Everybody else moved. And this place today in contemporary politics, the science of victimology, everybody wants to be a victim. So you would have tribes that have no genetic or any historical relation to some remains from 10,000 years ago, claiming, which is just part of contemporary politics, and then other people would jump over to try to represent the victims. Again, there would be budgets associated. And that's, again, because the artifacts cannot talk for themselves. The bones cannot talk for themselves. And then somebody comes and advocates for them, and that's not archaeology. That's just contemporary politics. I'll stop for now.
Yeah, I think it's true. Of course, our artifacts can't talk for themselves. There have been a certain type of person who's been talking for those archaeologists, though, since the beginning of archaeology. They've been like people like Howard Carter, funded by wealthy men. And so I view the role of things like feminist archaeology to try to counterbalance that. If people recognize that artifacts can't talk for themselves, then these narratives would have been different. But people have been imposing certain viewpoints that have been ignoring certain people, women, for example. And thus I view that as just a corrective measure of the viewpoint that has already been imposed. I don't suggest that we limit it just to intentions only. So on that framework that I gave of the distinction between the 5 different groups, 4 of those categories were intentional, 2 of those communicative, but then the top one was non-intentional. So I certainly don't propose rejecting the science side. Of course, a lot of archaeological evidence is not about intentions. It's, as I mentioned, carbon dating, imaging techniques, things like that. But much of what happens in archaeology is these proposals about meaning. Even classifying something as an artifact, I view as making a claim about a mind. So right from the get-go, we are already doing something. You said it was telepathy. I wouldn't characterize it as that, but archaeology is in the business of making claims about mental states, and I view feminist archaeology and the role of indigenous people as a corrective on a disgraceful history of how archaeology has been conducted going back to Carter. Of course, now today many archaeologists are involved in rectifying some of these problems. And so of course
is archaeology inevitable?
I think we're still on that, right?
Yeah, it seems to me.
Is it Arvid's side or is it us?
I think it's Arvid.
Is everything reducible to the political? Can't we have non-political?
Arvid, we could.
Yes.
You were cut off shortly.
I'm sorry. The question was, is there a non-political archaeology? Is there a possibility of having non-reducible archaeology and historiography that are not reducible to politics? Can we play this game of inferring from the evidence without having to have this or that politics?
I mean, let's think about Napoleon going to Egypt. That was a political maneuver under the guise of an archaeological expedition. So I think no. I mean,
we agree on that, and that was, of course, pre-archaeological. That was pre-science. Archaeology only started in the late 19th century when they had when they invented scientific method. My question is there such a possibility? I mean, we know that the word was very.
The views of women is political, then I think that archaeology should be political.
I think we have to move on now. You can discuss it later on. Correct? if there's need. But there are a few more questions, and we can come back in the end if that's okay. There are two more online, but first the room again. Is there anybody? Okay. Otherwise, it would be first, I think, Sebastian, and then Jonas. Online, still both of online.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for your talk. My question will be perhaps a bit off topic, so be quick if it's the case, because I'm a philosopher of language and not a philosopher of archaeology. But I like very much the idea to use philosophy of language in this framework for epistemology of archaeology. But you use a very particular philosophy of meaning, where meaning is associated to intention. Okay, so there are other approach of meaning where, for example, meaning is not in the head. You have an externalist view of meaning. And so my question is, do you think that it will be possible to use this kind of externalist approach of meaning in archaeology? Because it has been used in aesthetic. For example, you could say that the meaning of a work of art has nothing to do with the intention of the author. And then to understand the meaning of a work of art is not to understand the intention of the author. So my question is, do you think that externalist conception of meaning could be of any use in archaeology?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, so certainly archaeologists have been drawn to applying structuralist models of meaning to archaeology. So Peirce and Saussure have been applied. Since you're French, it sounds like from your accent, you might know the work of André Leroy-Goron. He has a famous book from the 1960s in which he attempts to apply a kind of structuralist theory of meaning, which is based on an archaeology of these binaries between masculine and feminine, day and night, light and dark. This is how archaeologists have kind of developed that. In the cave of Lascaux, for instance, he went and classified things as masculine or feminine, and yeah, wasn't doing what I'm doing here of relying on the mind. From my perspective, those types of views aren't that successful, and independent of this talk today, I'm a tried and true Gricean for meaning across the board, as I've said. So yeah, potentially there could be efforts to try to take different theories from philosophy of language and apply them to archaeology. To my mind, that hasn't been successful as it's been done so far. I just think the intentionalist view, it certainly has some difficulties, but the intentionalist view doesn't mean that we can't rely on systems and symbols that are repeated across contexts. It's just that what we're aiming at when we're trying to get at meaning, it's not really what the symbols mean, it's what the person meant by those symbols. And this allows us to explain cases where people are deviating or where the meaning is richer than the symbols themselves. So for a work of art, I think an intentionalist view, you said perhaps like we could have other views of art where the meaning of the work of art has nothing to do with the intention. I think that to my mind, you have a lot of difficulty cashing that out. My views on that are shaped by Noel Carroll, who I studied with when I did my PhD. He argues in his work that art interpretation is really more of a conversation between the audience and the work itself. This allows us things like, so for instance, in Noel's work, he talks about film interpretation in the Stanley Kubrick Spartacus film. There's one scene where you can see the watches of the Roman soldiers, and Kubrick was known to be meticulous with his details, but it was just some someone in the costume room didn't get all the hundreds of extras they had to take off their watches before this scene. So we could watch a scene like that, and if we weren't thinking about the intentions of the director, we might, read something into the watch itself. But if we were taking an intentionalist account, it can allow us to see meaning that's different than the work or the words themselves. It can help us explain slips of the tongue. So as you know, in philosophy of language, like we have a slip of the tongue type cases as well, that I think provide further support for a Gricean picture. And in Gricean picture of meaning in general. And then for all of those types of reasons is why I think Grice is right in general. And then that's another reason Grice is right in archaeology. It's right, though, of course, as David mentioned, in archaeology, there's another layer. With Kubrick, we do interviews, we can ask him, what did you mean? Different artists will answer that question, more or less indirectly. We know about the art world of Warhol, so we have a lot more context, but I think we're actually aiming at the same thing in archaeology, despite the added epistemic difficulties.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Great. I think we got two more online questions. Then we might have to come to a close already, unfortunately. It's first Jonas Alskog and then Joni Matti-Kukanen. First Jonas, please.
Hey, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
great. Thanks. I very much enjoyed your talk. My question would be about how you think about evidential inference in archaeology, because you mentioned in the beginning that one problem with Currie and your criticism of him was that it was sort of singularly focused on philosophy of science and the inference from that only evidence from traces, so to speak, as I think you formulated the point. Because I started thinking that one way to articulate the human side of archaeology that you're interested in would be to articulate what evidential inference in archaeology must involve. Because, for example, if we think that the logic of a evidential relation is that it's a one non-present phenomenon is considered a sort of indication or an alleged indication of or a present phenomenon is considered an indication or an alleged indication of something non-present. And so, for instance, if you have a pile of bricks and then you want to say that what this sort of indicates, and to do that in archaeology, to make an evidential inference, and you're interested in how you try to also imagine sort of a social world in which this pile of bricks has some kind of role. For example, that it's a Roman fortification or something of the sort. So in a sense, identifying something as archaeological evidence presupposes this sort of imagining a social world in which this pile of bricks has some role in the life of the agents that you're interested in. So, and why I pose this question is that because I think that there might be a danger. Perhaps you didn't mean it in that way, but to somehow make the case for the human side of archaeology by creating some sort of division between the question of evidential inference and questions relating to philosophy of language and aesthetics. And one interesting point here relating to Collingwood is that considering the questions of identifying something as archaeological evidence, he has this essay in the Principles of History where he compares evidential inference to the reading of a language, sort of to understand sort of the social side of what these artifacts, what kind of role they had. So you have to imagine a world, so to speak, of empire and what kind of role fortifications have in that for trying to distinguish this pile of bricks from some sort of other construction or what it might be. So yeah, this was quite long, but my question would be that how you think about evidential inference in archaeology and how it connects up with your ideas about philosophy of language and aesthetics.
Okay. Yeah. I think so. You would, when you're making a hypothesis about intentions, you would still be doing that based on the traces, as it were. Yeah. So that would still be true in the language and aesthetic cases, trying to kind of construct a picture or construct a world based on those few pieces of evidence that you do have. So I think yeah, that part of Currie in particular about like the evidence from traces, he uses that, you know, and I can go look back at that section in the text that where I took that exact quote from, but he kind of uses that as a way of creating these parallels between archaeology, geology, and the paleobiological examples, that those are evidence from traces. And yeah, I would agree that, you know, if we can acknowledge that and acknowledge there's something distinct happening with archaeology, and that there the hypotheses about meaning would still be based on those traces.
Okay, thank you. Then finally,
Right. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, if I understood, yeah, thank you.
Finally, Joni Matukan, and then Marilynn, you got the last word.
Oh, okay.
After that.
Okay. Well, you hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks a lot for your talk, and I guess I'm representing the other center located in Finland. Greetings from Lapland too, where I happen to be. I have two questions, and they are sort of simple. The first one is, do you think philosophy of archaeology is a form of philosophy of science or subfield of philosophy of science? Because even if you think it deals with intentions and aesthetic values and such matters, I don't think it's a problem, because we can obviously think that there's a lot of different kinds of sciences requiring different types of philosophies. So actually the conversation is then reduced to the question whether there is one general science requiring one general philosophy of science, or rather whether there are many kinds of them. So in other words, it's an issue between pluralism and universalism, and what science is, what it requires, understanding science. For example, I think philosophy of historiography is a subfield of philosophy of science, I would argue, with its own specific problem. So that's the first question. And I asked the second one too, going back to the beginning and the metaphor of handmaiden, philosophy as a handmaiden. I totally agree that it would be a sorry state if philosophy were a handmaiden to sciences, but also it wouldn't be a great situation if it tries to be a sort of a master or thought police of scientists, and that would be a sorry state also. I think those both options are seen. So what can we do? Of course, we can think of philosophy as an autonomous field with some problems, conceptual issues and such, but hopefully with some relation to the sort of, in the case of philosophy of science, to the object sciences. But then, this is my question. Wouldn't be the optimal situation where would we have a philosopher, let's say, of archaeology, who also practices archaeology? So this is kind of deep practice term in a way. So actually doing archaeology through philosophy or philosophically, or with an awareness of philosophy. And the same applies, of course, to other forms, to history, or maybe even to the sciences. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. So let me start with the first one. Yeah, so you said is philosophy archaeology a subfield of philosophy of science? My first instinct to say no. But you know, as you articulated, if historiography is a branch of philosophy of science, I mean, perhaps science, if we have a very, very broad definition of science, but I do think, you know, within the sub-disciplines of philosophy, you know, we're talking about interdisciplinary work between archaeologists and philosophers, but of course, you know, we have our own norms, customs, considerations, frameworks that are like readily at our fingertips in different disciplines. I think philosophy of archaeology so far has mostly been treated in this way as a subfield of philosophy of science. And I see my argument today as basically arguing that aesthetics, philosophy of language, and ethics are all have something to add to that conversation. Of course, you know, science and scientists are aware of, just to some extent, of values in philosophy. There are debates about, you know, feminist philosophy of science and so on. But yeah, I think there is something to be gained from those other disciplinary frameworks. You know, the last time I presented this talk was at a philosophy of biology conference. You get certain types of questions there, an aesthetics audience, or even a fashion audience listening to this, right? Everybody will have different things that jump to mind, different like theoretical commitments. And so I think for that reason, we should maybe free philosophy of archaeology from the philosophy of science lens and see what can be added from viewing it in these other ways. Is not a subfield of any branch of philosophy, but is something that philosophy as a whole has something to contribute to. Yes, I agree. We have the handmaiden, or you said like the master or the thought police. Yeah, hopefully we can be somewhere in between. And the question of like what to do about that is also a personal question in a way, right? Like, what should we do as philosophers working in this discipline? Like, what should I do as an individual? What should you do as an individual? I mentioned I've gone to some archaeology conferences. The last time I gave this talk at that philosophy of biology conference, I had an archaeologist tell me a lot of other conferences that I should be going to as well in archaeology. But we all, you know, due to the nature of academia, we have constraints on our time, what we can do. It's hard to, you know, be a master of all domains. I do know a couple of people who have a PhD in biology and a PhD in philosophy, for example, who do philosophy of biology, but that's a pretty high bar. There are also, of course, archaeologists who are very theoretical. I had some quotes from Colin Renfro. He's very theoretical in his thought. You know, he has a very clear philosophical mind. He's clear in the cognitive archaeology work that he's done of some of those implications. Francesco D'Errico, whose shell slides I included, he also has some really interesting work that's basically philosophy of mind work. And he's coming to a conference that I'm helping host in Paris in November. So ideally, it's through those actual conversations with archaeologists, with philosophers. Personally, I'm trying to get invited so I can tag along with archaeologists. Every time I meet an archaeologist, I kind of offer to follow them on their next dig. And yeah, ideally we can chart that path, try to have charitable conversations between the two, not just make easy theoretical points for maybe how they're using philosophy in a very flexible way that philosophers wouldn't. And yeah, through these good faith efforts on both part, I think we can slowly but surely arrive at better theories of philosophy of archaeology.
Okay, great. I think some very fitting ending words. What remains to be said is now only to thank you again, Marilynn, for being the speaker today. And of course, we will reconvene today in a week already for the next talk. And it will only be online.